thank you for joining us today on this webinar, which will be recorded. I hope this will be an engaging and relevant topic for all of you. It is important for us at Nuffield Health to understand how our services fit into the corporate workplace. So as the experts in health, we can recommend which areas you need to focus on in order to improve the health of your workforce. Our aim is to promote and help you implement preventative measures whilst providing a seamless and integrated approach across all of our service lines. So why this topic on sleep, fatigue, and always on culture? Well, sleep is important for both our physical and mental health. And when we consider sleep, it isn't just the number of hours that we get, but the quality of the sleep, which is important. In studies, sleep has been shown to improve memory recall, regulate metabolism, reduce mental fatigue, and is necessary for proper cognitive and behavioural function. Whilst we sleep, our brain consolidates the information from that day. Cellular waste byproducts which have accumulated throughout the day are removed so that our brain can function normally the next day, and our body is able to promote cellular repair. Lack of sleep makes us more emotionally labile, increases the risk of certain disease profiles, and is known to be associated with chronic musculoskeletal disorders. As a GP, I often have patients presenting to me with poor or disturbed sleep, tiredness all the time, low energy levels, and I know that this will at some point start to impact their performance, whether at work or in their private life, if it were to continue. When these patients present to me, it is often after several repeated episodes of sleep disturbance, or as a result of a prolonged episode that they are currently struggling with. GPs will of course investigate the medical conditions that can precipitate tiredness and fatigue, thyroid dysfunction anemia, for example. We will screen for mood disorders that often present with poor sleep, such as depression, stress, or anxiety, or we'll intervene with therapeutics if pain is the trigger. But ultimately, in the absence of a medical condition that is treatable, the mainstay of medical intervention for poor sleep will be the medications that we prescribe specifically to treat insomnia. These have a role in some instances only, and only for short periods of time due to their side effects and the risk of physical dependency. So what then can we do to capture these patients and intervene before their sleep and fatigue becomes a medical problem and starts to impact on performance? To discuss the topic of sleep, fatigue, and always on culture further, I would like to introduce you to our panel of experts. We have Brendan Street, who is our Head of Emotional Wellbeing. Brendan has worked in the field of mental health as a nurse and therapist for over 25 years. He is passionate about improving the conversations in the workplace around mental health. We also have Mark Cole, who is our Head of Physiotherapy, and he is a chartered physiotherapist with over 15 years experience working in occupational health. Mark has a special interest in ergonomics and creative working from solutions. And then we have Justin Jones, who is our Head of Physiology. Justin has a Master's in Sports and Exercise Physiology and has 15 years experience in the health, fitness and wellbeing industry. He supports our corporate clients in making sense of their health and wellbeing data in order to form their wellbeing strategies. Together, they all focus on the interplay between sleep and its effect on physical and mental health, how these in turn can impact function and productivity in the workplace, and how the pandemic may have affected us further. If you have any questions, please drop these into the chat function, as we will have time to address these towards the end in our Q&A session. So, to commence this webinar, I would like to hand over to Brendan, who will start by explaining why we sleep and why is sleep important. Brendan.
Thanks, Nati. Easy question first then, thank you. I think in the answer, the answer to that question is we don't really know. And I think, as you indicated in your introduction, there are various different theories about why we sleep, but we don't really know. And it's interesting as well, because asking why we sleep is a little bit like asking why do we spend time awake. There's no real one function. We need, our biology needs both. And Andrew, if you just move to the next slide. And I think they were interesting in terms of around sort of the reasons why we sleep. I think some of the quotes up here are interesting and pull us into that sort of discussion about why we sleep. The one on the top right there, in terms of we often adopt this childlike perspective, and I think often we see it as just lying down for a bit and doing nothing. And I think then when you look at stats like the testicle one there is interesting in terms of men who sleep 5 hours a night, less than 5 hours a night, have smaller testicles than those who sleep 7 or more. Now I think that is testament to this idea that sleep is involved physiologically, that there's something about physiology that is important in terms of sleep. The other one there, the other quote there that's interesting is that if sleep doesn't serve some vital function, it's the biggest mistake evolution ever made, because while we're sleeping, we're not doing stuff. We're not doing stuff in terms of, procreating. We're not doing stuff in terms of making money, looking after kids. So unless it's serving some vital function, then it's a big mistake to doing it. And I think the key here is that I think if you're going to do one thing in terms of business to improve performance and productivity, then sleep is the biggest thing that they can do. Improve sleep, you improve across the board in terms of performance, productivity, creativity. So it's doing lots of different things. And I think for too long, a lot of companies have overvalued employees who chronically undervalue sleep. So that idea that pulling an all-nighter or being able to do long hours is in some ways valuable to corporates. And I think we'll find as we go through this presentation and some of the stuff that Justin will say and that Mark will say, we'll find out that that really isn't the case, and that we should value people that value sleep. We just move to the next slide, Andrew. And again, in terms of Justin and Mark will come in on this in terms of this next slide. But for me, from an emotional well-being perspective, sleep's really important because it's like a Swiss Army knife of health. And you'll see there on the right-hand side that it taps into so many different areas of health. And later on in the presentation, we'll see how it taps into mental health, concentration, creativity, etc. But also just handing over to Justin now and just a bit discussing with Justin in terms of the impact in terms of physical health.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Of course, sleep does impact physical health in various different ways. And what we interestingly see is there's a bit of a U-shaped relationship between sleep and what we call premature mortality, or basically dying at a younger age. So people who don't sleep enough, particularly less than kind of 5 hours a night, end up dying younger, but people who sleep a lot end up dying younger as well. And there's a bit of a sweet spot of around 7 hours a night that we really tend to see. There are a number of different reasons for that, and quite simplistically, we can look at things like blood pressure and hypertension. So, for example, with your blood pressure, we know that when we sleep, our heart rate and our body temperature drop, and our blood pressure drops as well. Now, let's say you spend, 8 hours a night asleep. 8 hours of the night asleep. So that's a third of your working day. That's a third of your working day where potentially you've got a lower heart rate and a lower blood pressure. If you actually half that to only 4 hours a night, all of a sudden you've gone from having that lower level of heart rate and blood pressure and cardiovascular strain for a third of your day. You've actually then lowered that to a sixth of your day. So what we end up with is more miles on the clock. We also see a relationship between sleep health and weight as well. So two of our main appetite regulators are things called ghrelin, which basically tells us when we're hungry, and something called leptin, which tells us when we're full and promotes levels of spontaneous physical activity. So when we start to gain weight, your body starts to pump out more and more leptin to say, stop eating so much and why not go for a walk? And then when we get really skinny, and we're in a state of famine, the body does the opposite for ghrelin. Now, when we sleep, our body actually regulates those hormones, and we see that if we sleep too little or too much, they're out of whack. So we end up eating more and moving less than perhaps we would normally. And then the final one I want to come on to talk about is diabetes risk. So what we actually see from a diabetic's perspective is that insulin sensitivity significantly reduces as well if we have poor sleep. So we have to pump out more and more insulin to get a similar response, and we increase our risk of things like insulin resistance. So that's kind of looking at the longevity, cardiometabolic risks associated with that. But there's also some functional risks around how musculoskeletal health and sleep play in. Mark, why don't you pick up on that?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And I mean, if we look at the number one cause of kind of absence from work, we now know that musculoskeletal conditions have been superseded by emotional and mental health, poor health. But musculoskeletal conditions are still one of the main causes of absence in the workplace. Now, as a physio, and when I trained, nearly 18 years ago, we were really taught to touch on sleep from a, can you get comfortable when you sleep if you've got a musculoskeletal disorder? Back then, we were never looking at the relationship between sleep and musculoskeletal health and vice versa. But now the recent evidence is coming, a couple of years ago, there was a big article that published to look at the effectiveness on sleep with those with musculoskeletal disorders. And it's a bit chicken or egg, really, Justin, to be honest, whether those with musculoskeletal disorders are suffering from poor sleep because they're unable to get comfortable, or indeed whether the lack of good quality sleep is a predisposing factor for people to have an onset of musculoskeletal conditions, particularly chronic low back pain, for example. So I'm quite fascinated by, what is the pattern between whether somebody the poor sleep is causing it, or the musculoskeletal disorder is causing the poor sleep, for example. And I think one thing to kind of delve into, I'm not going to get too scientific at all, but when it comes to good quality sleep, and I think we might touch on this in a little while, but you've got two types of sleep. You've got REM and non-REM. And when it comes to the important part, but both elements of sleep is important, but the research has shown that the deeper kind of REM, non-REM part of our sleep is when our growth and repair happens. So if somebody is struggling to really have that good quality sleep where their body can undertake the repair of itself, and that includes the repair of muscles, tendons, ligaments, etc., then if they're not experiencing that good quality sleep, the body, you could question whether the body is giving the best opportunity to, heal itself. And therefore, if it isn't, it's waking up the following day without having that adequate growth and repair stage during sleep. And so you're cracking on with a new day without your body going through its natural repair stage. So I think that's what's really fascinating for me. Now, when it comes to somebody with pain and sleep problems, there's a bit of a vicious circle, because if somebody is in pain, we know, if you've hurt your neck playing rugby or badminton, whatever it might be, you go to sleep that evening and you really struggle to get comfortable. You try and position your pillows and you position yourself the best you can, and then you don't sleep very well. You then get a sleep problem. You then get stressed and anxious about it. That then causes more sleep problems. Does that sleep problems therefore cause you more pain and anxiety? And you're in a vicious cycle. Now, when you take sleep out of the equation, we know the relationship between mental health and physical health is very prominent. So, I've just touched on musculoskeletal impact for now, but as far as the relationship between how we break that cycle from an emotional health perspective, Brendan, I think let's pass on to you to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think there's a massive, I think your connection there with pain and into the emotional perspective and the impact of sleep on emotional well-being and emotional well-being on sleep is really interesting. And if we go to the next sort of slide, which picks up, and I'm not going to pick out all the stats here, but I think what's really interesting to me as a clinician and treating people is that stat there of 35% of the British population suffering from sleep problems. Now, what I see as a clinician is that sleep tends to be the gateway. It tends to be the gateway into experiencing mental ill health. So it tends to be the first thing to go. And then the problem is once you start to experience mental ill health, your sleep's gone, and because your sleep's gone, you tend to have some of the functional problems that are associated with not having enough sleep, and then you get stuck in a vicious circle. So I think that prevalence there is really, really interesting in terms of this stat, and then you'll see across the board in terms of why we think businesses need to really wake up to sleep is that impact there in terms of that physical, that amazing stat in terms of how much more likely you are to have a heart attack or stroke if you're not sleeping well, right across to 80% of long-term poor sleepers suffer from low mood, and they're 7 times more likely to feel hopeless and unlikely to feel alone. Now, the effects of sleep then start to get amplified. So the effects of poor sleep start to get amplified because once you get into that period of feeling alone, loneliness in itself has a negative impact on emotional well-being, but also physical health. Feeling lonely has the same impact on your physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So you'll see you've just gone from sleeping poorly into poor mental health, into loneliness, into more physical problems, and that real interplay there that happens. And then that, again, in terms of those consultations, that tiredness and fatigue are the primary causes of 1 in 5 of GP consultations. Again, that amplification of a sleep problem leading to emotional well-being problems, physical problems, and exacerbating need to go to a GP. And then the added effect of that is that then sleep starts to affect your relationship with other people. Relationships with other people are really key in terms of emotional well-being. So then another vicious circle spins off. And I think all this interaction, this connected physical, emotional health that seems to be bridged by sleep, then leads into the next slide, which is then how does that affect productivity in the workplace? You click on Andrew. Tap. And I don't know whether you want to chime in here, Justin, in terms of these stats. I mean, again, we don't need to call out all of them, but you can see the actual, the big cost that, put sleep deprivation has on productivity in the workplace, and why it is, from a personal perspective, preventing the distress of individuals, but from a commercial perspective, it's definitely worthwhile looking into how sleep is impacting on the productivity of your workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point as well. I mean, workplace accidents, according to Health and Safety Executive, are estimated to cost in the region of 240 million on their own. So we know that poor sleep and fatigue can certainly lead to accidents at work. Down to many of the things that yourself and Nati also touched upon, things like reduction in creativity, reduction in problem solving. One of the main reasons why we sleep, or one of the main theories, is this thing around brain plasticity, so that your body can kind of learn and make sense and form long-term memories. And it's those long-term memories, I guess, that give us the experience that make one person really good at their job and therefore really productive versus someone who's quite a novice in their role. But it's also touching on the thing that Mark mentioned earlier around musculoskeletal issues being a leading cause of absence from work. So not just productivity, but actually workplace absence. And I touched upon it earlier, didn't I, around blood pressure, diabetes, and the impact that they can, the influence that sleep can have on them. Well, we also know that acute medical conditions such as those are, again, a leading cause of absence.
Yeah.
Now, this probably ties into the fact that absence, yes, it costs organisations, but absence rates in the UK have been dropping for around 25 years. They've never been as low, and actually they drop at a quicker rate during times of economic uncertainty. You look at the credit crunch in 2008, you look at Brexit a few years ago, and are we potentially seeing the same with COVID now, where you're probably going to see a drop in your absence rates, but what is that doing to productivity? And ironically, what is that doing to people's effectiveness at work? And are people working longer hours? We know that remote workers, for example, are likely to work earlier and work later than people who are actually in the office. Mark, I know that's something you've done a lot of work on at the moment in terms of the impact that remote working is having on our working patterns. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, in an article that Nuffield Health published in 2020, in around October time, we did a survey out to our corporate clients that looked at the impact on individuals working and what COVID has done, particularly remote working. 70% of respondents reported that work from home had increased musculoskeletal aches and pains, not necessarily diagnosed conditions, but just those general aches and pains, for example. So definitely the idea that remote working has negatively affected people's health, I think it's probably relevant that that is the case. But at the same time, with regards to people work from home, is the aches and pains as a result of people work from home in a different type of laptop settings, or is it in relation to people working more and more hours? And this comes back to the point Nati made right at the beginning, which is that, this concept of being always on, always on. From the moment you wake up, your laptop is in your bedroom potentially, or it's at the dining room table when you're eating breakfast. It's there when you're eating your evening supper. So I think the information that you or the insight or your predictions about what COVID might do to workplace absence is one that's going to pan out over the next few months and potentially years when we analyse the data, because I think we will find a similar trend as you talk about the kind of financial uncertainties that Brexit and financial crisis have led. But I think this is different because this will be in modern day, this is the only financial crisis possibility or the cause that's caused by a health-related pandemic, right? So we haven't really in modern day suffered from a health-related pandemic. So I think it's going to be really good to see, well, not good, it's going to be really interesting in months to come to analyse the pandemic on both financial and people's health compared to other financial crisis and work-related crisis events. But that, you know,
sorry, Mark, there's a really interesting thing you mentioned there around kind of people waking up with their laptop in the bedroom, as it were. And a study by the Royal Society of Public Health showed that whilst 1 in 3 had disturbed sleep if they're working remotely, and that's people working from either a dedicated office or a dedicated desk in a living area, that increased to 1 in 2 having disturbed sleep if they were working either from the sofa or from the bedroom. I know, Brendan, you and I have talked quite a lot, haven't we, in the past around that kind of concept of bedmin and how that stops people from switching off. Are you seeing a kind of a spillover into your area there?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at, for me as a therapist, the 2 main things that I would do with somebody in terms of improving their sleep is something called sleep hygiene. So that's good habits around sleep, and something called stimulus control. Stimulus control really sings to what you were just saying there, Justin, about bedmin and doing admin in bed. Basically, there's no stimulus control there. You're associating your bed with a lot more things than just sleeping. And that is the way to really disrupt your sleep pattern. So you're right, I think, and we'll see later on, maybe in some of the slides in terms of this coronasomnia, that the way that we've been forced to work because of COVID has led to this increase in difficulties sleeping. And I think that is something that, yeah, like you said, Mark, that's going to be really in terms of research interesting to see how that pans out over time, because I think to a degree, for the medium term at least, there is that degree of remote working that's still going to happen, but it's how do we have good sleep hygiene techniques and also good stimulus control so we get away from this real detriment on our sleep.
Do you think that could come into some of the existing health inequalities that we see as a result of coronavirus? And I'm thinking around suitability of working from home. So before the pandemic, around 5 to 10% of the workforce were working from home. That obviously went up to around 50% during the first lockdown. But I guess from a health inequality perspective, I'm thinking that actually the people who are likely to have dedicated office spaces or dedicated space in a living area are likely to be those later on in their career, perhaps with their own homes, perhaps more affluent. Whereas actually, if you're a 20-something working in a busy city like London, Liverpool, Manchester, perhaps you don't have the ability to not do bedmin. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and if you look at the impact of COVID, it's affected all of us, but not all of us equally. And I think one of the areas where you can see that amplification of inequalities is those living with low resources. So people living with low resources are a lot more impacted by COVID, and particularly in terms of their mental health, and as a consequence, particularly in terms of their sleep. And you're right, those are the people that won't be able to have a dedicated office because they're living with low resources, likely to impact on their sleep because of that, likely then to impact on their mental health. And they were already more likely to be impacted on their mental health by living with low resources, so that it's amplified. And I think if we go to the next slide, that's where that amplification leads to, in terms of, like you said, I think you touched on, Justin, in terms of that impact on that ability to function in the workplace, and then knocking on to a health and safety type issue, because it's then affecting concentration and then leading to more accidents.
And what do you think that employers, and probably a question for Mark actually, because I know he's going to be asked this a lot, what is there that employers could do to actually, I guess, bridge some of those health inequalities? I've seen some research out there, surveys showing that around 64% of remote workers felt that employers should contribute towards funding office equipment, 50% thinking that they should contribute towards funding office furniture or Wi-Fi and phone utilities as well. Have you seen anything of that?
Yeah, definitely, Justin. I mean, first things first, it's important to reference the health and safety executive legislation that does stipulate that if you have got home workers, you are just as accountable to those home workers in their home, their place of work, as you are if they were working in your office space. But that, you know, there's a terminology called reasonably practicable, right? So when it comes to a court of law and legal requirements, it's doing what's reasonably practicable. Now, if we rewind to the beginning of the pandemic, you know, almost a year to the day when this was starting off, we were delivering webinars to a number of organisations to talk about the short-term fixes to preparing you to work from home. So we were talking about, you know, the use of boxes under laptops to raise it up, a quick and easy keyboard and mouse that you can purchase online just to make do. Whereas that shift is now, organisations are now recognising that long term there is going to be a hybrid way of working between the home and the office. So not only are they looking at more creative ways that people can work from home and use what they've got, but there are lots of policies that's being written by organisations about whether they use a bursary. You know, they provide some type of £5, £10, £15 per month contribution to people towards their, you know, both their utility bills, but also if they wish to choose to purchase their own equipment to aid their work from home. And I think as long as organisations are thinking creatively around what they can do to support people, and you know, that is reasonably practicable. And I think going back to the topic in hand around sleep, you know, we've all got a duty of care to our employees to look after them, and particularly prioritise those people that have, you know, are working from you know, their main bedroom where they've got a bed and a desk and a chair, and they're not got any switch off time. So I think that's what we've got to be very much mindful of. I think on that topic, Justin.
It's interesting that there was an EU initiative. Obviously, we've seen it in France, the right to disconnect, isn't it? Brendan, yep. We've heard of this concept of coronasomnia as well. Do you want to expand a little bit about that? Because I know it's something you're quite interested in.
Yeah, and I think, and just linking it to this last stat on this slide, that for me is really interesting, is that 86% of working adults feeling unable to speak with confidence to the line manager about fatigue affecting performance. And I think to your point there about this idea of coronasomnia, and if we just move quickly to the next slide, this idea of coronasomnia, that there's something happened during COVID-19 that has impacted on our sleep. And if you look at it, you've got loads of anxiety around about jobs, about children, about homeschooling, about kids going back to school, about finances. So that anxiety is causing insomnia in itself. Then we've got the stuff that you've already talked about, Justin and Mark, in terms of change of habits. So the bedmen are working different hours, eating at different times, and then you've also got this like connected vicious circle. So you've got insomnia causing stress, causing more insomnia, and then sleeping in the day, odd meal times, increased alcohol, weight gain. All this adding up to this coronasomnia. So I think we're all fatigued by it, and then you pile on the exhaustion from lost sleep, and many of us have got to the point now where we're fed up of being fed up, tired of being tired, and we're stuck in those vicious circles. And if we just go to the next slide, it definitely is having an impact. And I think the watch out for employers is, if employees were already reluctant to talk about the impact that fatigue has on their performance, and like you said, Justin, we're starting to enter an environment where people are starting to get more worried about their jobs and finances are tighter, then people are going to be even more reluctant. But there still is this big impact on mental health and cognitive functioning of COVID. So if you look at COVID, and King's College did a really interesting study that 50% of the population feel their sleep's been impacted. So that's a lot of people that are going to be worried about talking about their fatigue. So I think it's really interesting that we need to really wake up to sleep in the experience of COVID, because it's likely that we're going to have almost like a sleep echo of the effect of COVID-19, and we need to keep an eye out for that in terms of employers, and we'll come to it later in terms of the talk about what can employers do about it to support. But I think the first thing they can do is actually heads up that something's coming in terms of sleep.
And do you think that next wave will come fairly soon? Because again, I know in the past we've spoken about this concept of re-entry anxiety. So whilst we're moving away from, say, the majority of people remote working, and we're going to end up with probably more than we had in the past, but not quite as high as we've got at the moment, as the vaccine rollout continues and lockdowns end and the roadmap goes on, you're going to have a lot of people going back into the office, and not everyone's going to be 100% comfortable with doing that. So actually we might find there's a month or two where sleep is really impacted because it's a change in our environment, right? Where all of a sudden we're having to set alarm clocks again and jump on a train or go sit in traffic. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think definitely you're right in terms of that change of environment. That's going to come in waves, well, because I think that final stat on there, that 62% stat, that people facing financial difficulties because of COVID report that their sleep is disturbed more. That's probably going to come in waves because the financial impact of COVID is going to come a bit later. I think the other thing to watch out for in terms of being an employer is that age group 20 to 24, because they report sleeping longer but feeling less rested, and I think there are different things that are going to impact on the quality of sleep for that cohort of people. So I think you're right, Justin. It is going to come, but it's probably going to come in different ways. So you've got the re-entry anxiety, you've got financial concerns, you've got resettling into different life organisations. So yeah, definitely, it's going to come in waves.
And I think probably circadian rhythms, as we're changing the seasons, might actually have an impact as well. I know that people are going to be potentially sleeping at different times than they were previously, perhaps waking up a bit earlier with the lighter mornings as well. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think definitely, and that then comes to what can we do practically in terms of, as employers, and leaders, what can we do practically to actually counter the impacts of those changes on sleep.
Something I noticed actually recently from the always on culture that I think we've done quite well internally, is I received an email from someone recently, a fairly senior member of the team, and at the bottom of the email it just said, "I am sending this email at this point in time because it works for me. I'm working flexibly. However, I have absolutely no expectation that you will read or respond to this email at your time at this moment in time if it's outside of your working hours." I think that was just a really good, simple way that our organisation is kind of saying, hey, it's okay not to be always on. What are the other kind of practical solutions that you think are out there?
Mark, do you want to lead on that in terms of practically?
Yeah, and I think one message I've kind of got, and recognising the types of people that might be listening into this recording, is one that we've learned in the physio world, which is when people go for physio, patients are not always expecting the physio to ask about their mental health, for example, despite it being so very much connected to physical health and musculoskeletal conditions. So one thing that the physio world have adopted is the idea of the physio asking about their sleep, because it can provide that corridor to allow people to open up about their mental health. And I think we've all got a little bit better about talking our mental health, and the whole message about it's okay not to be okay, but there's still going to be several employees and patients out there that feel anxious about talking about that. So I think my shout out and my call to those watching to work with their employees is almost be open about sleep. Maybe that's your way in, that's your corridor to opening up about other negative or poor health. So simply saying, how did you sleep last night? How are you finding your sleep? We're probably going to be a little bit more open about that than simply saying, how is your mental health? How are you feeling in yourself? So I think, Brendan, that's something you've taught me and something we've implemented into our physio practice. So that would be my practical top tip for the employees watching here, or the employers watching here.
Justin, what are your thoughts in terms of the one top tip for employers?
One top tip. I guess my one top tip is actually try to help people to help themselves. So there's a lot around here. I'm taking some learnings from some of the kind of remote work we've done around health assessments and GP services and stuff in terms of improving health literacy. The best expert of your own health is you. And I think it's a little bit the same here. So if you teach people some of the practicalities around things like sleep hygiene, and that can be a bit of a lunch and learn, it can be in a newsletter, it can be pointing them to useful resources using your wellbeing partners. I think then people can take the things which will work for them and which won't work for them, rather than trying to, shoehorn in hygiene factors which work for you but might not work for the wider population. So I think focusing on education is going to be really key.
Yeah, good one. And I think I'm going to be cheeky and have two. I think for me, there's probably two top tips. One is for individuals. And I think for individuals looking to, I think it was you, Mark, that mentioned, or might have been you, Justin, mentioned about the oxygen mask situation. So for individuals and leaders that want to improve their own sleep, I would say think small but act big. We often make the mistake when we're trying to improve our sleep of doing too many things. And I think you need to focus on one small thing but act big. So really commit to it. So whether that's not taking your laptop to bed or going to bed at a certain time, always getting up at a certain time, just change one thing first, but really commit to it. So think small, act big. So that would be the first sort of tip. In terms of the second tip, it's more of a wider tip for employers. Be coherent. And I think that is about making sure that, one, you set expectations. So set really clear expectations, a bit like you said, Justin, there in terms of that email that, I'm sending this, but you don't need to reply. Set really clear expectations about, as an employer, what you expect in terms of finishing times, what you expect in terms of answering emails. The second bit is about education. So really put out education about sleep hygiene and stimulus control so people know about it. And the third thing is policy. Make sure you have a policy that encapsulates all these things. So what is good sleep? How can people get it? What are the benefits of it? And what are the expectations? But make sure it's a sleep policy, not a fatigue policy. So, because I think in too many businesses, it leaks into just a health and safety thing that looks at the negatives. So looks at what fatigue will bring. Whereas I think we need to switch it. Have a sleep policy that actually says, if we get good quality sleep as individuals, then that will drive productivity. So switch it round. So I'd say that those two things: think small, act big, but also be coherent in terms of your policy as an employer.
Thank you, Brendan, Justin and Mark, for a very interesting summary on how sleep can impact not just mental health, physical health, but also workforce productivity and the COVID pandemic impact. We've got a few questions that have come up. The first one is regarding what should a line manager do if they are concerned that an employee is not sleeping? Where should they refer this person on to, occupational health or a GP? As a GP, I would say referring them back into general practice is always a good starting point. But I'm going to pass this question on to Brendan, because we've already said that sometimes sleep will be a good way of opening the conversation to the broader topic of mental well-being. Brendan.
Yeah, I think in terms of who to refer on to, I think, like you said, occupational health or a GP is a really good area. I think also it's like I said before, having a wide range of options within the workplace that people can look to, because a lot of stuff with sleep can be really helped by self-help. So if you've got access to self-help sort of platforms that tell people about what is sleep hygiene, what is stimulus control, I think it can reassure people about sleep concerns anyway. I think the first thing you'll notice as a leader or a manager is changes in behaviour. So somebody that's normally, problem solving, that they're on time for meetings all the time, that they're not dishevelled, starts to look different. And I think that might be an indicator that a person's not sleeping as well. But it might not necessarily need an intervention at level of OC Health or a GP. And prevention in terms of acting early, in terms of your return on investment, is much bigger. So it might be that you can go via a self-help route and direct that person to those education tools. Because often I think with sleep, often is it just me, or are these difficulties something that I need to get further help with, or could I help myself?
Thank you. Another question. Somebody's asking, does vitamin D deficiency cause sleep problems? So Justin, I think, and Mark, this is probably relevant to the two of you. So we know that vitamin D deficiency is associated with an increased risk of sleep disturbance, poor quality of sleep, and it's also linked to chronic pain. So Justin, starting with you in terms of the physiology of sleep and vitamin D, and then Mark, on to you in terms of the musculoskeletal impact.
Yes, sure. Vitamin D has an important role to play in how our body works and produces. So melatonin's a really important hormone produced by the pineal gland, and it basically controls our wake and sleep cycles. And there is some research showing that vitamin D has an important role to play in regulating this, but I think probably more research needs to be done before I could conclusively say that anyone should consider a vitamin D supplement as a result of that. So I'm sitting firmly on the fence there. Sorry, Nati.
Mark?
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
no, really interesting. I mean, vitamin D plays an important part in our immune system, and certainly with pain as well. So, you know, there is definitely going to be a link between vitamin D and improving things such as aches and pains of the legs, the shoulders, etc., etc. As far as, you know, I'll probably go with Justin that you know, inconclusive with regards to sleep, but definitely with regards to pain. So maybe if somebody is suffering from aches and pains and vitamin D is helping with the aches and pains, maybe that's had a positive knock-on effect on the sleep. Again, it goes back to my chicken or egg example I gave earlier. But if it's working for that individual, then excellent. It's really good.
Thank you. Just to caveat their fence sitting, the World Health Organization does actually recommend that most people in the UK should actually take vitamin D during the winter months, because we just don't actually make enough. So what they recommend is between 1,000 to 5,000 international units to be taken every day, which you can get over the counter. The last question that's coming up, which is probably an interesting one. How can we encourage teenagers to go to bed before midnight so that they are refreshed now that they're back at college and school? And Brendan, I think perhaps a more kind of approach in how do we coerce our children to get into bed early?
If I had the answer to that question, that's the holy grail. I think that it's difficult because so when you look at it, and it's probably the subject of another presentation altogether in terms of the needs of sleep at different points of our lives. So in terms of you go from cradle to sort of getting older in terms of where you need sleep. And I think teenage children are interested in terms of where they need sleep and the amount of sleep that they need. So I think that's why it's difficult to encourage them to go to bed. But I get the point. And part of it's about technology and what technology they're using in the bedroom. Part of it is something called sleep restriction, which is a technique to get better sleep efficiency. And that's about spending less time in bed, but more time sleeping. And there is a way that you can calculate what your sleep efficiency is and then gradually plot your bedtime so that the time that you spend in bed is time sleeping rather than just being in bed. So you do wake up more refreshed. So maybe, and this is a hard sell, but maybe in terms of that tip would be to sell the benefits of sleep restriction to somebody so that they're actually going to bed to sleep, not going to bed to be on the laptop, to be on the iPad, on social media.
Thank you. Another question that's come through is regarding employees that work night shifts or finish late. And I think this ties in with the brief touch point that you had on globalization in the workplace. So Justin, would you like to start off with that? So how can we improve this? for employees that work night shifts or finish late?
Sure, yeah, and it's a really good question. And like Brendan, if I could fix it, then you know, it's $1 million thing. My partner's actually a midwife, so she often works night shifts. So I have first-hand experience of this. The problem with night shifts and stuff like that is that it messes up our circadian rhythm. But the traditional sleep hygiene factors of avoiding stimulants before bed, making sure that the room is a cool temperature, perhaps having a warm bath, because that can stimulate it's not necessarily the warm bath itself which makes you sleepy, but it's going from being very warm to being very cold, which tells your body actually it must be nighttime. It's kind of an external temperature regulation, if that makes sense. And probably the most important one is getting really decent blackout blinds. I mentioned melatonin earlier as something that regulates our sleep-wake cycle. Your body produces melatonin when it's really, really, really dark. And actually, if you try and sleep in the middle of the day with the sun coming through, you're really going to struggle in that respect. So there's no kind of silver bullet. You need to do all of the good things that we would naturally do, but just try to apply them in the day instead, unfortunately. But being in a dark room is probably the most important one. Don't know if any of the other chaps have got a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Justin. It is a tricky one, and I think the key to shift working in terms of from the psychological perspective is treating your working time as if it were day, and treating your bedtime as if it were night, even though they tend not to be if you work in sort of shifts. So, and then, like you said, Justin, treating that working time as day, making sure you're getting that exposure to some sort of light at the start of the shift, but by the end of the shift you're reducing that light so that you're ready to go to bed, and vice versa in terms of when you're going to bed, like you said, Justin, in terms of those blackout blinds, and also using, I mean, like you also said, Justin, the sleep hygiene and stimulus control techniques that you would use anyway are still valid for shift workers. You've just got to slightly alter them, and things like sleep restriction are still valid in terms of shift workers. So using that idea of sleep restriction, so you're in bed to sleep, not in bed to just lie there, is still a technique that you can use, but you just slightly have to alter them in terms of the shift working.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, what I've come across in shift workers is the amount of caffeine people drink during the latter stages of their shift, and that's the equivalent of us drinking, you know, cups of coffee, black cups of coffee just before bed. You know, so it's exactly what you said, Brendan. You know, taking your work time as work time, and then your downtime, and then your sleep time, and getting into the habit of avoiding, you know, heavy caffeine use towards the end of their shift, if they're then going to go home and do a bit of personal time and then into sleep, because we do know that caffeine does block the receptors that is natural for us to build up and gain that sleep pressure that prepares us to sleep. So that would be my other thing around the kind of shift pattern as well.
Yeah, good point.
One question that's come through that ties into this, with regards to the always-on culture, where does exercise fit in? So is exercising late in the day bad for sleep? Justin?
Yeah, really good question. Exercise generally is very good for your sleep, because when you exercise, your body increases adenosine, which Mark kind of inferred to previously. So adenosine is something that increases our sleepiness, and the more active we are, the more adenosine we produce within the body. So your sleep urge will increase. However, high intensity sleep increases something called cortisol, and cortisol does the opposite to, say, melatonin, which makes us sleepy. Cortisol makes us awake. So to put it, I guess, in a fairly primitive manner, when you're going running, your body doesn't know you're running to try and look good on the beach or stay fit or whatever. Your body thinks you're running away from something. So when you stop running, your body releases all of these endorphins to go, great, you've escaped, well done, here's a reward, and you get those happy hormones. Now, running causes a form of anxiety in the body from time to time, and it's recovering from that anxiety that makes us stronger. So high intensity exercise before bed can actually have a detrimental effect on sleep. I've mentioned anxiety there, so I know Brendan's probably going to want to jump in and add to that as well in terms of how exercise can be used in that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, echo your point about, you know, exercise being really, really useful in terms of sleep pattern, but also making sure you're not exercising too late in the day. I mean, I think in terms of exercise is probably impacting on sleep pattern in two ways. Directly in terms of sleep pattern, but also, like you hinted there, Justin, in terms of that the way that exercise is connected to better mental health anyway. So if you're less likely to be anxious, less likely to be low, you're more likely then to get good quality sleep anyway. Because like Mark touched on before, sleep is that gateway into mental ill health, but also a good gateway for employers in terms of talking about mental health. So yeah, definitely in terms of that that use of exercise, definitely in terms of it improving mental health, but also improving sleep via improving mental health.
And I think definitely avoiding competitive sport, I'd say, late in the evening. You've just got me thinking there around that kind of competitive nature and the type of hormones that are released. So I wouldn't necessarily say competitive sport late in the evening would be useful. More like a gentle walk or a jog or something.
So that's the five-a-side competitive inter-team football matches out then Justin.
Exactly.
And I think if I hijack the question about when to exercise, I mean, you know, I wouldn't be a physio and specialise in kind of ergonomics and work from home if I didn't suggest that midday exercise or breaking up the working day with some type of exercise would be the, you know, most beneficial from a physical musculoskeletal health perspective. So, you know, absolutely avoiding exercise late in the day just before sleep, but, you know, hijacking it and adding the ergonomics piece, you know, definitely take time away from your working day to switch off both mentally, but also take that break away from your desk where you've probably been working for several hours in the morning and then going to be working several hours in the afternoon. So that would be my suggestion on that exercise piece.
Thank you, Mark. Another question that's come through is more of a tech-based question. So smartwatches tend to show us what stages of sleep we have during the night, and what should the stages of sleep be? And does that then correlate if we are tired all the time? Do these watches then tell us that we're not getting into the deeper stages of sleep, and that's the trigger for the tiredness? Justin, you're nodding your head and tech-based.
Yeah, so they're obviously not as accurate as your kind of research-based technology that we use to study sleep. But how they work is essentially they measure your heart rate and your movement patterns to determine which stage of sleep you're in. So when you're in non-rapid eye movement sleep, we tend to move a little bit, but our heart rate is very low. And when you go into rapid eye movement sleep, which is your stage of dreaming, your heart rate starts to increase, as does your body temperature, as your brain activity starts to go up, but you don't move at all, because otherwise you would end up acting out your dreams and that kind of thing. So if you're hardly moving in the night and your heart rate's gone up, that's when this app or wearable tech or whatever it is will say this person must be dreaming at that point. And we typically go through cycles, there are things which can block us getting into those deeper stages of sleep, and the dreaming stages actually go on and on and on and get longer and longer as the night goes on. So yeah, these apps will tell you if you're not sleeping correctly because of how you move and your heart rate and stuff. Don't know if any of you ever, Mark, Brendan, you got any thoughts on those?
I mean, you know, I think the use of technology is excellent for raising awareness to our health. What we've got to be careful about is that technology doesn't drive and take over our habits sometimes, you know. So I think it's about balancing the use of technology and devices to see how you're doing, but also preventing that obsession with using data to drive your health. I think there's an absolute balance. Data should drive your health, but without it becoming too much of an obsession, because that could then, you know, increase that anxiety further. If you're not achieving what the device is telling you should achieve, that could then trigger that anxiety further. And that probably brings us on nicely to Brendan's view on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's obviously a multi-million-pound industry now in terms of scaring us to death about our sleep and making us spend more and more money on it. And I think often, like I said before, in terms of individual tips, it's think small and act big. don't overcomplicate it. And in terms of a lot of techniques to actually get a good quality sleep, they are quite simple but quite tricky to do. And you don't have to invest in loads of high quality tech or loads of different things. Do you know that the purchase of silk pillowcases since COVID has gone up by 533%? And then weighted blankets is 250%. So it's like people overcomplicate what you need to get a good night's sleep. And I think that's because an industry is scaring us to death about it. But it comes down to quite simple things that we can all do. But it's about not overcomplicating it sometimes. And like you said, Justin, that tech and Mark, that tech it can be important and it's a good guide. But don't get too scared by it and don't overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
I think one of the best bits of tech actually is just a pen and paper, right? How well did I sleep last night on a scale of 1 to 10, and what did I do the night before? And that's where you can see some of the habits that you've done, which will then work for you. Like, oh, I did exercise at 5 o'clock yesterday. I'll try it again tomorrow and see if that's had a beneficial effect. Or I've had caffeine on this day and I slept rubbish last night, so maybe I'll drop that out. You can kind of trial and error it and see what works for the individual.
Yeah, just giving us an insight into your personal diary there, Justin, about how you record your daily reflections. Yeah, love
exactly.
It.
And one more question, which is actually a little bit more of a medical question, and it's regarding the difficulty that women experience sleeping due to menopause symptoms. And I have my views on this as a GP, and we know that sleep and mood disorders, it comes under what we call the psychosocial impact of menopause on women's health. But Brendan, there are lots of ways that mental health workers and emotional wellbeing workers can help women manage these symptoms, rather than me as a GP suggesting HRT. Any top tips for women going through the menopause and impacting sleep?
I think really it's looking at what is causing the difficulty in sleeping. So I'm a CBT therapist, so from a cognitive behavioural perspective, you'd look at, in terms of thinking, you'd look at physical symptoms, you'd look at behaviour, and you'd look at emotions, and you'd want to look in terms of an individual, you know, what's happening physically, what's happening thought-wise, what's happening emotion-wise, before you jump in with any interventions, because the intervention could be, I mean, thinking is a really interesting one in terms of sleep, because often thinking about and worrying about getting to sleep stops us getting to sleep. So if you look at it and there's a lot of unhelpful thinking around sleeping, for example, then maybe that's where you need to intervene. If you look at it and there's a lot of physical symptoms that are preventing the symptoms, say hot flushes, then maybe that's where you need to intervene. So you need to probably do a bit of a formulation, a view of what's going on, to then look at what you could do to help the issue. And it might be a combination of different factors, but you're right, it's not necessarily a medical intervention. It could be a more of a self-help, healthy living intervention.
Thank you. So I'd like to say thank you to Justin, Brendan and Mark, our SME.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar for the questions that you have posed. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and it will be made available to you shortly. Thank you again.